A final way of skewing test data is to hide unwanted drug reactions under less frightening terms. This trick was used in the notorious Paxil Study 329, where such side effects as aggressive events, homicidal thoughts, and homicidal acts were categorized under the word hostility, while under the nebulous term emotional lability were filed suicidal thoughts and actions. In many cases, clinical trials are set up not to look for violence and suicide at all.
It is a problem that if these clinical trials don't specifically really ask a lot of questions about the nature of suicidal ideation and how the person feels and hopelessness and akathisia, if they don't ask those questions very specifically, they're not going to really get that data, and it's not going to come up.
Designing biased trials to avoid negative findings, interpreting the raw data to favor your drug, and spinning the entire study to accentuate the positive are just some of the many, many ways to bias a trial. It is this perfect storm of intellectual dishonesty that has led one drug expert to conclude that it can be proven that most claimed research findings are false. But it is the drug companies that own the studies. And when they believe they have compiled enough evidence to convince regulators that their drug is safe and effective, they submit their Phase 3 clinical trials for approval. The FDA only requires that 2 clinical trials be submitted, so drug companies can conduct as many studies as it takes to find the 2 that have the best chance at FDA approval.
You only need 2 positive trials against placebo, and it doesn't matter if you did 1,000, as long as you get 2. And it's amazing, sometimes they actually don't. They might pool data from another couple of clinical trials in order to get that approved.
They don't need to report all their data. They don't need to report all the trials that they do. They only need to report the ones that they want. They can handpick whichever one they want and then submit just those couple to the FDA.
As FDA Director of the Division of Neuropharmacological Drug Products, psychiatrist Paul Lieber complained, the sponsor could just do studies until the cows come home, until he gets 2 of them that are statistically significant by chance alone, walks them out, and says he had met the criteria.
The New England Journal published a study about a year ago showing that many clinical trials that had been conducted and registered with the Food and Drug Administration were never published because they came out showing no significant advantage over placebo. So antidepressants are not as effective as they are being made out to be, and the side effects are not as emphasized as much as they should be.
This point was driven home in 2008 by psychologist Irving Kirsch and his colleagues, who obtained every clinical trial ever submitted, published and unpublished, from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration of 4 new-generation antidepressants. The results were both alarming and enlightening. In Kirsch's words, antidepressant medications have reported only modest benefits over placebo treatment. And when unpublished trial data are included, the benefit falls below accepted criteria for clinical significance. In addition to this, volumes of effects associated with these antidepressants have since been discovered, including homicide, suicide, and mass murder.
People really don't realize that from the beginning there's been a question of how marginally efficacious these drugs really are apart from placebo.
And yet we have horrific side effects. Combine the 2, and where's your risk to benefit ratio? It's down the toilet.
But psychiatrists dismissed Kirsch's study because psychotropic drugs are big business, and clinical trials are a big part of that business. Take, for example, Martin Keller, former chair of the psychiatry department at Brown University, lead author of the so-called Paxil 329 study. This clinical trial, which tested hundreds of children on the antidepressant Paxil, found that the drug was generally well tolerated and effective, which in scientific terms is glowing praise. And the study's list of co-authors, 22 of the most prominent key opinion leaders in psychiatry.
I mean, that was a lot of people, but they were the who's who of psychiatry, and this was going to be a publication that I think, took them, into the end zone on getting their approval for kids.
With the FDA's blessing, Paxil became a blockbuster in the child and adolescent market, with sales of $55 million in 2002. It wasn't until the New York State Attorney General's office sued in 2004 that the truth finally came out. The raw data showed that not only was Paxil no more effective than placebo, but the young patients on Paxil were 6 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts. In fact, this data also revealed that 11 of the 93 children on the study developed serious side effects, of whom 7 had to be hospitalized. But according to Keller's own administrator, many of those children were either dropped from the study or coded as non-compliant to avoid having to be counted. While admitting no guilt, the drug company settled out of court for $2.5 million, less money than Paxil was grossing every 7 hours. Hundreds of civil suits followed, but when Dr. Keller, as lead author of the Paxil 329 study, was deposed by attorneys, he would not admit to much.
I can't remember exactly what I said. I don't remember anything specific about any of these meetings. If my name wasn't on the top, I wouldn't remember ever having seen it. If I saw them, I don't remember. The answer is, I don't remember. I don't recall if I was. I don't recall asking him, which isn't to say that I didn't.
I want to pick up on the question Mr. Coffin asked you about the 5-fold increase of the Paxil kids experiencing suicidality over the placebo kids. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
And you said that you weren't particularly aware of that, except for with regard to a manuscript that was sent to you in confidence by GSK?
Correct.
That actually is not correct, though. I mean, this was an issue that had been presented to you by a number of different reporters that you personally responded to. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
How could Dr. Keller have known so little about the drug study of which he was lead author, and which he himself used to promote Paxil for children in prominent medical journals and conferences?
The ultimate publication of Study 329 was ghostwritten by an agency hired by GlaxoSmithKline, and eventually they, after the manuscript was written, they put Martin Keller's name on it as an author.
You know, there again, and maybe you can tell me where I can find it in the paper.
No, I'm asking you if you were aware.
I don't remember the specifics.
And then we finally showed him a document from GlaxoSmithKline where GlaxoSmithKline says that the study was entirely flawed. It was a complete failed study, and it certainly didn't show that Paxil was remarkably efficacious for treating children and adolescents in depression.
Can you read that into the record, please?
Essentially, the study did not really show Paxil was effective in treating adolescent depression, which is not something we want to publicize.
We asked him, with that information now, how can you tell us that it would be okay and safe to give a kid Paxil? And he couldn't answer the question. He sat back, he put his head in his hands, and for, the longest 2 minutes sat there silent.
During the last 2 years of his Paxil study, Keller personally pocketed $1 million in drug company money, none of which he disclosed in his published research.
When people look at the field of psychiatry and they hear all these reports in the New York Times and Boston Globe, and they see this psychiatrist or this psychologist, took money and didn't disclose it, they wonder, well, is this causing a biases, in the field? I think that's a legitimate concern of the public because of the fact that it is true.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz, and with me I have psychologist Larry Kiel. Larry, I'm really glad you could join us for this episode. What we just saw on Marketing of Madness was an episode, a portion where they're talking about research on depression, where people don't even know, the people who did the research don't even know anything about the paper that they published. And there was a paper showing that antidepressive medication should be given to teenagers. Did you think that's a good idea?
Not only do I not think it's a good idea, but the research shows that teenagers and children under that age are at a special risk of suicidal thinking, as well as suicidal and violent behavior.
And so when you take a drug that actually alters the brain chemistry and could add to the cognitive confusion or whatever problems the person was having. Now, one thing that I've heard a lot is that if you really care about people, you want to help them take psychotropic medication, because that is the strongest thing that people can do. In other words, it's the sort of thing that you talk through problems first, and then if that doesn't work, you do something serious, which is take a drug. Do you think that it shows that people are not caring about the pain that people feel if they don't encourage them to take medication?
Not at all. While some people may benefit in some ways from medication, so we're not putting it down totally, there are many people that take medication and it leads to adverse effects, but no benefits in the depression or anxiety they feel. One of them called me today, and she had just been put on one of those medications, and suddenly, after starting it, became very suicidal. Dangerous.
Well, tell me, what are some of the alternatives that people can use if they're not taking medication? Like you mentioned exposure therapy to me during the break. What?
Yes, well, we talked about cognitive behavior therapy, which is changing your distorted thinking, and the therapist helps you to identify it. I wish we had more time to talk about that because it's fascinating. Exposure therapy is an evidence-based treatment that helps with post-traumatic stress disorder and has been shown to be much more effective than drugs. And it's having somebody relive the trauma.
You relive the trauma and you learn a way to respond to it other than ruminating about it over and over
Exactly.
again.
Bringing down the anxiety and giving it proper perspective.
Now, we don't have very much time, but you also mentioned to me perspective therapy, which you thought was very good. So in about a minute and a half, do you think we could get into perspective?
I'm going to first tell you about behavioral activation, another evidence-based treatment which helps people to change depressed behavior and anxious behavior into non-depressed behavior and non-anxious behavior. And a number of experiments have shown that that works for adults and children. Perspective-taking therapy, which I invented myself, really has to do with getting people to see what was, what wasn't in their past, what is now, but what is not now, the distortions again, in order that they make the best judgments about what could be, and then with the therapist they're able to strategize as to what would help them out of depression, anxiety, OCD, and other...
And what's OCD?
OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder.
And what
going through rituals.
People, and a lot of people have that. It's very widespread, isn't it?
Very much so.
People feel like they have to go through the same ritual over and over again to the point where it can be really disruptive in your life.
Yes.
Okay. And what sort of thing could you do in perspective therapy? Very briefly in about 10 seconds.
Okay. Well, if your father was very abrupt and cruel to you, but you don't have a sense of why, going back to look at the history there to see there what was, might show that he was an alcoholic.
Okay, and so you need to deal with it. Larry Kiel, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of Green Time, and be sure to look at us because we're going to be on this time next week.